Good evening, Tom. How are you?
We're very well, Simon. Thank you. I hope you are too.
Yes, I am. Very well, in fact. And season 3. How do you feel about that?
I can't believe it. It's absolutely fantastic. And we're getting more and more very interesting subjects to talk about.
I can't believe you're still talking to me after 2 seasons.
Well, the 40 miles between us helps. That's fine, fairness. You know what they say, distance lends enchantment.
Chris and I have got a mutual friend who was formerly the strongest man in the world. And sometimes he'll say to me on the phone, you're cheeky when you're on the other end of the phone.
That's very true. Very true.
I know exactly what he means if he got a grip of me. Tom, season 3, a bit different from what we've been doing for the first 2 seasons. A bit risky. It's exciting for you and I, and hopefully for our listeners at Crime Time Inc. The only way we're going to know that is if we get some feedback. So I think that's the first thing we want to talk about tonight, the new things that we're doing over the next couple of months. Firstly, we're going to have daily podcasts. How does that sound?
It sounds exciting. I agree with you. We've been going on now for a while, and the feedback we've got has been very good, but there's not enough of it. We depend on feedback for future direction. So it'd be good to hear from people what they thought.
Yep. And I listened to our podcast today, part 2 of our live show. We were talking about the need for feedback so we know we're heading in the right direction. The way to do that is to leave reviews for us, Tom. We've got all these platforms. We've got our social media, of course, Twitter, Facebook, all the rest. We've got our website at crimetimeinc.com. You can even leave a voice message there if it's too much effort to type. And we've now incredibly got all of our back catalogue right from season 1, episode 1 with George Barnsley, available on YouTube, and comments can be left there as well. So there's no shortage of outlets for the podcast and for the listeners out there to get back to us and let us know what they think. Those reviews are very important for the future of Crime Time.
It is, and I've got to say very well done to our chief engineer, Chris, who works long hours to get all these things done. It really is a super piece of work.
He's done very well, but don't tell him I said that.
No, okay? This has not been recorded.
So, daily Crime Time Inc. now, we've got an episode going out, and obviously you and I wouldn't have the time to do that on our own. So we've recruited our team of researchers, our deep dive consultants who every day produce a short podcast. It probably averages about 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes, but it covers some of the most heinous crimes globally now, not just here in Scotland, and gives us an opportunity to look not just at the crimes themselves, the victims or the perpetrators, but to the issues that it raises for policing and for society as a whole.
That's the bit I enjoy. I think they're doing a super job, to be honest, and the span of their research is quite incredible. For us to research these things to that extent would take us ages, but I'm very excited about it, and they've certainly come up with the goods, and we're going to be talking about that tonight, of course.
Okay. So, Tom, our deep dive partners we've put out the 6th this last week. How did you feel about the quality, first and foremost, of their deep dive? They obviously have to summarise things to get them to fit into 10 or 15 minutes because that's the brief that we've given them. What did you make of them this week? Did you enjoy it?
Enjoyed it very much. Enjoyed them very much. The extent of the research is amazing. For me, they were food for thought. And I'm looking forward to talking about some of their presentations tonight because I think there's other things that we can say or contextualise, but first class, really first class.
Okay, let's get right into that then, Tom, because the very first case that they put out last Monday was the Lockerbie case, which you and I are familiar with from different perspectives, from working in different forces. So, Tom, what's your recollection of that horrific day in December 1988?
Very clear recollections. It was the night of the Christmas parties. All the divisions and departments were at their Christmas parties. 22nd of December 1988. I remember we had bleepers at that time. I was a superintendent in uniform. Very briefly, I got a bleep to phone the ops room. And basically what they were wanting me to do was arrange to gather together for first thing in the morning the names of about 50 officers from the division I was in to be taken down to Lockerbie because a plane had come down. And at that time, they didn't know what had brought the plane down. They only knew that a large aircraft had crashed over this very small town of Lockerbie in Dumfriesshire. That was my first memory. So straight away, I got onto our admin team at the division and called them out and went back to the station and try and identify the officers who we would send the next morning down to Lockerbie.
Well, I was involved in that too. I was night shift that night at the Serious Crime Squad in Glasgow, and I got a phone call from the control room not long after we came on duty to say that there'd been a plane crash in Lockerbie and that we needed manpower for the morning to send down first thing in the morning. So I phoned Detective Chief Super Joe Jackson and got the book out, the shift book that we used, the big giant. Probably something similar you had with all the names of detectives in it. And he had me go through that name by name. And he told me who he wanted to be going in the morning down to Lockerbie. And then I had to start making the phone calls. There was 3 or 4 of us on duty, so between us we had to make the phone calls. And that was life-changing for some of the people we phoned that night. Because they were thereafter involved in that inquiry for 2 or 3 years. They never came back to the office, really. They became Lockerbie detectives. So that first day was sorted. I finished night shift that night, and I was told that I would begin down the next morning. So I went down on the 23rd. I went down with a team in cars. And that's what it was every morning from then on, certainly in the first early stages. The Serious Crime Squad was sending 3 or 4 cars down, and I know that there were cars going from other divisions. Where do you get the resources from when something like that happens, Tom? Do you take a wee bit from all the different divisions and departments?
Well, that's what we did. We sent down 200. We sent down buses and cars with 200 officers from Lothian and Borders, mainly from the city divisions, which had more people. And we sent them down every morning, 5 o'clock parade, 6 o'clock wheels up. And we down to Lockerbie and back, working 12-hour shifts and back late at night. And I always remember the old divisional commander, I was the deputy divisional commander, the old divisional commander, David Donald, he was one of these old school guys who had a real interest, almost like a paternal interest in his boys and girls, he used to call them. And I remember him in the weeks that followed. It was a very cold December that year, as you might remember. But I remember him going out at 5:30 in the morning regularly with a huge big box of Mars bars to get on the buses and hand out these Mars bars to all his troops, because he felt bad that he wasn't going down with them, but he was certain he was going to support them in any way he could, any small tangible way he could. But as you say, it was life-changing, and I've met several officers since who really, that terrible scene that they met and the work that they did down there stayed with them. And some of them have handled it very well and others not so well. And I bumped into a gentleman, and I won't name him because I haven't given him notice, but he was an expert witness in the case, and he was a scientist who was down there. And he's done some studies on it. And I don't know if you remember, but also sent down in the first 2 or 3 days were a lot of very young soldiers, young squaddies, just teenage boys out of training school. And they suffered very badly. And there was a lot of mental health issues arose from them. As regards the podcast, I thought it was very good and very factual, but it missed the deep dive, boys and girls, missed the beginning. And of course, none of us know the end. And so what we heard on that podcast was the middle bit about the downing of Pan Am 103. But for the context of the story, I think you've got to go back to the July of 1988 and the shooting down of an Iranian passenger jet over the Gulf by the USS Vincennes, the American destroyer. And you remember it was a mistaken thing. They were under attack by Iranian gunboats that had a helicopter shot up, so they were on high alert, and they saw this aircraft on the radar. They mistook it for a military aircraft coming from Iran and fired 2 missiles at it. And unfortunately, it was a passenger jet that came down and killed, I think, over 250 folk, civilians on the passenger jet. And so that's where, for me, that's where the story starts, because And there's been a lot of talk about how it was nothing to do with Libya, it was to do with Iran, and therefore everything that followed and the arrest of Megrahi and Fahima and all that was wrong, and we were off on the wrong foot. I've never believed that. What I have always believed is that, yes, Iran probably were the people who called the hit, if you like, that resulted in Pan Am 103, but that Libya were the guns for hire and that Libya carried it out. So I think for me, you've got to put that in context, that here you had Iran, who had an aircraft shot down, who were seeking revenge. You had Libya, who under Gaddafi were guns for hire, and they'd already supplied arms to the IRA, etc., etc., etc. You also had actors like the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who again were a terrorist group, and they would act as proxies if someone wanted to take out a contract. And so I think all these things are true. And I tell you, I think that coming up in 2025, I think there'll be a lot of new information come out, because Abu Masood, who is a bomb maker, a convicted bomb maker, will appear in New York on trial for making the bomb that downed Pan Am 103. And I think there'll be evidence come out there, Simon, which will silence a lot of these conspirators. And I'm certainly hoping that'll be the case. And I'm waiting. I'll be very interested in that trial, or the trial of Abu Masood, in the spring of 2025 in New York.
Fascinating, Tom. It's interesting that, and you and I are going to have to get used to this as we review, as Series 3 goes on and we get more accustomed to listening to the shortened version. Lockerbie story told in 13 minutes or whatever. It is very much a summary, but it's interesting that it takes a world view, if you like. And I think that's partly why we did it, to take away the local interest of you and I and look at it in a global perspective. So it's interesting that they picked Lockerbie as an example to do that in the very first instance, because they can look at the bigger issues, they can look at the factual information about the flight and where it left and how many were killed and all the rest of it. But you and I knew people who spent a big chunk of their careers working on the inquiry. And I knew, like you, I knew people who were really badly affected by it, and it manifested itself in some horrific ways. In an episode, our second very episode of Crime Time, I think we talked about PTSD, and I think that's what you were alluding to a bit there, that it affected people. But you had already said in that episode, I think, that it was, the amazing thing was that more people didn't suffer PTSD. And I put that down to in our perspective, the travel arrangements, that we were going together, that there was teams of us together, we were working together, and we were traveling back and forward together. And I think that gave us time to put a suit of armor on before we arrived down there at 7 o'clock in the morning. And it gave us time to unpack and take it off again on the way home. You agree with that?
I do. I very much do. I think a lot of people told me that the problems only started when they got off the bus and went home, because naturally their families wanted to know. It was world news. They wanted to know what they've been doing, and some of them, of course, were inquiring for their own welfare. How's it going? How's it? And that was that the families are not to know it, but that could be very unhelpful, because the truth of the matter is that they didn't want to share what they'd seen and what they'd done, and they felt it to be intrusive. And this is quite a common thing, which I've experienced myself, coming home and being involved in something, and remember the family saying what happened, and you find yourself saying, none of your business what happened.
Yeah. And the truth is, you just don't want to go there. You want to unpack when you come home. You want to stop thinking about it.
Well, that's right. But there's also this thing. But I agree, the transport arrangements were the thing. But it was a dreadful event. The one thing that upsets me about it is the fact that the conspirators are bandying about names of long-dead detectives as being either incompetent or corrupt or something. And I object to that very strongly, because I knew these people. I worked with these people, and they were the finest, they were the greatest guys, and straight as a die, and they're no longer here to defend themselves. So I really take strong exception. And I've gone public saying this is wrong.
Yeah. They're easy targets, Tom, aren't they? We see that in the news all the time, that you can dig up these cases from 40, 50 years ago. And I had it recently with one. I don't know if you noticed it during the week. There was an article in the Herald, in fact, it was last Sunday, about undercover work. And it was even contradictory in the article, because it cited, there's a big inquiry going on. It's been going on for the last 6 years into undercover work. And he had latched on to the fact that there had been 4 cops identified who had fathered children whilst undercover. And that was out of over 1,000 undercover agents that were working in that field at the time. And he didn't mention that 4 out of 1,000 doing that kind of work and having to inveigle themselves into those environments. Isn't that bad? A batting average, of course. But he latched onto it for his own purposes. And the whole article to me was sluiced. I actually wrote to the Herald and told them what I thought about it.
We're getting that just now with the police shootings, aren't we? There's a very good piece actually printed recently, been published recently, more or less saying it's remarkable how few people get shot by the police comparative to other European countries, let alone the United States. For the number of armed operations there are, which is about 17,000 per year, and the trigger's only pulled a couple of times. So Simon, you were down there in the first 24 hours. Latterly, I thought the organisation came together very well, but that first few years must have been a bit of a guddle. What were your observations?
It's like any major incident, Tom. You and I have gone into divisions to get involved in murder inquiries. And it is a guddle to start with. The major crime box comes out with all the paperwork and all the rest of it. And the first thing to do is to set up an administrative system to deal with that. The problem here was that there were 259 people on that aeroplane and 11 people on the ground, if my memory serves me correctly. And the immediate problem, Tom, you'll understand it, the problem every murder scene is to deal with the deceased. We had a major problem there to create a mortuary. And the mortuary that they created that day wasn't suitable. We ended up in the ice rink within a week or so. And that was the initial, everybody's hanging about really, waiting for instructions, but there was teams set up to go and start the identification process, to get computers into place, to get the manpower to deal with that in place. Those first 48 hours are really about getting the administration into place. And at the same time, the uniform cops that you referred to, busloads of them, again, it's rudimentary police work. You search the locust. Unfortunately, in Lockerbie, the locust was spread over 3 square miles and turned out to be a bit further than that as well. And that was the initial task, was to set up these teams to get those initial inquiries that you would do at any locust, just on a much, much more horrific scale. And people often say to me, what was the atmosphere like? What was going on? There was an absolute... I've been at Carstairs Hospital, Tom, as I dare say you've done, and the minute you walk in, there's a strange atmosphere comes over the place. I've been at Auschwitz, and I can't explain the atmosphere when you walk under the archway to go into the prison camp. And I would describe Lockerbie in those terms. Nobody's talking even as loudly as I am now, because everybody's in shock, and nobody quite knows how to process the information that's staring them in the face because of the scale of it. And at that time, stories are coming out about cars on the A74 that had been struck by debris, etc. There was still ongoing incidents being dealt with by fire service, etc. And searching in Lockerbie, because there was 11 people had been killed in Lockerbie by falling debris as well. So we had all these multiple loci. That's what we had. Everywhere that something had landed. So there was teams being split up into that. I didn't become part of that team. I was part of the transport at that stage. And within 2 days, I was finished down there. And I was quite happy to get away from it, Tom, because it wasn't a nice place to be at all.
No, I can imagine that. There'll be a lot more about this story to come, Simon, but I think our deep dive team have done a super job setting this up. And we'll be speaking about this again. Simon, what's remarkable is that 2 of the most significant crimes that took place in Scotland took place in the smallest force area, because the Ruxton murders which I've written about and we've spoken about, and I've written about the book Ruxton, the First Modern Murder, which changed the whole way that we deal with serious crime, the introduction of forensics. It's less than 20 miles away from Lockerbie. And so here you had twice within a space of 70 years, the smallest force dealing with the largest crimes. And on both occasions, what they did was very quick off their mark. They didn't try to handle something they couldn't. They called in assistance straight away. And in both cases, you saw a magnificent coming together, a joint working of the police forces of Scotland together with the academic institutions, the forensics, etc., etc. And isn't it strange that they both happened just in that very small, isolated part of the country?
Yeah. Something else that struck me about the Lockerbie case, Tom, and the only reason I didn't mention it is I didn't want you going off on one about Ruxton, and that would be another hour-long tirade, was that there's no question the biggest challenge that we had, certainly in the first couple of weeks of Lockerbie, was identification. And I'm sure that a lot of the techniques used, in fact, I know that a lot of the techniques used stemmed from that Ruxton case and the developments in forensic science that we had over the 60 years in between. So we could always, everything goes back to Ruxton. Everything goes back to Percy Silito.
That's not the stupidest thing you've said tonight. In fact, of course, the one of the main identifications in the Lockerbie case was by dental forensic odontology. And of course, that was a big feature of the Ruxton case. You're right.
Yeah,
you're right.
I knew I'd get something right eventually. And in the town itself, Tom, and to be honest, within a 10-mile radius, because you go for a coffee and you always have the logistics of these things to deal with as well. People have got to get breaks, they've got to, all the things that go on. In fact, in Strathclyde, we had an emergency incident team, the blue van that would turn up when something happened, when a major incident happened, to keep the troops fed and watered, etc. Well, you can imagine the logistics of doing that with something. Everything was scaled up 100 times. That's the truth of the matter. But overall, the atmosphere in the town was horrible. It was a freezing cold day, bitter, snap cold, and the smell of kerosene. It was misty, which just added a mist and fog to the whole place and made it look. And then you've got the camera crews, you've got those who've got to get managed as well. The world, the media descended on the scene very quickly as well. So all of that has to get managed. So it's a delegation process at that stage to handle it all. It's interesting that our deep dive team picked Lockerbie because one of the aspects of that was that the plane was headed to America and had many American citizens on board. And our deep dive team, possibly by coincidence, picked FBI serial killers as their second episode on Tuesday. And I'm not sure if our listeners will be aware of this, but you had some experience with the FBI, am I right?
Thanks for that introduction, Simon. Yes, I'm very proud to have studied at the FBI Academy and I've worked with the FBI. I found it a very interesting section that the deep dive team did actually, because the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit, they wrote the book on serial killers. It was they who first coined the phrase. And they really wrote the book, and it's been incredibly valuable for us all since that time. And I remember when I was over there, I did some work in behavioural sciences. Now, we over here, I suppose, actually we've been either lucky or unlucky, depending on our service, to have come across 2 or 3 serial killers. But of course, in the United States of America, they've got dozens of them to study. And I think that their tactic of going into prisons and interviewing people like Ted Bundy and these people, I think it's contributed significantly to our understanding of how these people work and how they organise themselves. When they were talking on the podcast about all the hallmarks of these serial killers, how they're very organised, how they live in compartments and whatnot, it rang a lot of bells with the work I did with Angus Sinclair, the World's End Killer, Robert Black. They all conform to these sort of stereotypes. But I'm still, in all, and we've discussed this before, all that's well and good, but you've got to catch them first.
Yeah. That's for sure. Before you can make the soup.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting, Tom, and they were very good at pointing out the popular beliefs about serial killers, and we're so tainted. The general public are so bombarded because Hollywood just does what suits it, doesn't it? And all the TV programs, all the stuff, and there's so many misconceptions out there. I like the way they put some of them to bed and got to the real stuff that's from the manual, if you like. How much do you think globally we all sing from the same song sheet then? Do you think the FBI are the template for us all as far as serial killer murderers are concerned?
I think they've added significantly to the whole canon of knowledge about these things. The one thing that I was interested in was that they correctly said that these people are manipulative, very ordinary looking people. They don't look like Hannibal Lecter. The swept back hair looks like Dracula. I'm always telling people that Angus Sinclair, who is the world's end killer, who I've written about and spoken about a lot, and the one who I was most principally dealt with, he was such an ordinary looking wee man. Quite honestly, Simon, you look more sinister than he does. In fact, in fact, let me just, Simon, you look sinister.
That's not a sinister look, that's a confused look.
Okay. But no, I thought it was a very good piece. And again, we'll come back and we'll use that as a reference piece. And of course, they went on to talk about John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy, who are good examples of exactly what they're talking about.
For sure.
But the other thing I would like to say about them is that I have found in my service that the FBI are extremely generous with their knowledge and with their resources. And when I was over there, they couldn't have been more helpful in trying to assist with our problems on the other side of the Atlantic. I found them very professional, good people to work, and I have many happy memories of them.
I think we've maybe got lucky with our deep dive team. Not lucky, I think we've picked well. They bring that different perspective, don't they, from across the Atlantic as well. And that's very pertinent to the next one I wanted to talk to you about. Was Dunblane, Thomas Hamilton. Because what they focused on was not the details of the case, because sadly we're all too familiar with the murder of 16 children, the injury to 15 others, and the school teacher, and Hamilton taking his own life. We're all far too aware of that. But what they focused on was gun law. And I thought that was very interesting coming from the other side of the Atlantic, who've got their own problems and their constitution to deal with. What do you remember about how we in Scotland, and you were a very senior officer at the time, how we dealt with the aftermath, the report that was done, the recommendations of the Cullen report within a year, and the Snowdrop campaign that took place throughout the UK to have the laws changed? How do you remember that being implemented and dealt with by the police?
Well, the first thing I remember about that morning, I was on duty that morning. I was the ACC Ops in Lothian Borders, and we got the call that there'd been a mass shooting in central Scotland, who, of course, were our neighbouring force. And I remember phoning the control room and telling them to send as many armed response units as we had out to our border, because we didn't know at that time the gunman was dead. We didn't know what had happened. We didn't know circumstances. All we knew, there was a shooting. For all we knew, there were people rampaging about with guns. And so we sent out everybody we could, all the ARVs, armed response vehicles that we had, fully crewed up and armed, and out to awaiting instructions. And I remember a lot of them left from Fetish, and I remember, literally 10 minutes after giving the instruction, watching the marked traffic cars go screeching out of the garage at Fetish, which was very close to my office, and heading away towards central Scotland. The tragedy, for me, the learning point about Dunblane, and I think the report was right. I think Lord Cullen did a super job. He was a tremendous judge, Lord Cullen, now retired. I think he's still alive. Tremendous, of course, he was one of the judges at the Lockerbie trial as well at Cam's Ice. He was a very prominent judge in his day. I think he got it right. I know there was a lot of resistance to the surrender of all handguns, but the truth of the matter was that Handguns were owned in Scotland as hobbies, as toys, and such was the horror of what had happened at Dunblane that it was felt that something had to happen. Some action had to be taken, and that was the action to be taken. And to be honest, I don't know if you remember the Sandy Hook school massacre in America. I think it was round about 2001, during Barack Obama's presidency.
Yeah, I remember the name, Tom.
The school at Sandy Hook. And again, it was a mass shooting. And again, it was young children, primary school children. And I remember sitting thinking, this is it. America are going to take action now. No country can have this happen and not take radical action over firearms. And they didn't. They didn't. And since that time, to be honest, Simon, I've said this to American friends and contacts, if Sandy Hook School being attacked the way it does and the death of these children did not change your mind, then nothing will. Nothing will.
Yeah.
And a sort of hell mend you stuff down. The other thing about Thomas Hamilton was, and the big lesson for me at that time, one of my jobs was the granting of firearms and shotgun certificates. I had to sign all the certificates as granting these certificates. And Thomas Hamilton was a guy who was a habitual complainer. He was always raising issues and complaining if he didn't get his way. And he was such a vociferous complainer that sometimes he drove authorities onto the back foot. And that's what he did in gaining his firearm certificate. He made so many complaints and he lodged so many bitter complaints and took legal actions and went to his MP and all the rest of it, that he was granted a firearm certificate against the better judgment of many people in Central Scotland Police. For me, that was the big lesson. That was the big lesson. Because thereafter, the more people complained about not getting a shotgun or firearm certificate, the more I was determined not to give it to them.
The old Groucho Marx one.
Yep.
The old politics one. Anyone that wants to be a politician should be disbarred immediately.
Well, I'm sure that's one of the great Greek philosophers has said that. But absolutely. But I remember that, and that for me was the learning point. And thereafter, I remember saying to our firearms department, "Listen, if you get anybody who's complaining," and we did have one or two, then the more we dug our heels in. And of course, you could appeal it to a sheriff. You could appeal the chief constable's decision to a sheriff against the non-issue or the revocation of a firearms or shotgun certificate. And I say, go ahead, do that, and see if the sheriff backs up. But of course, no sheriff in the right mind, and by a sheriff for our worldwide audience, a judge, we call them sheriffs in Scotland.
Yes.
No judge, no sheriff in the right mind is going to go against the decision of the chief constable.
Can you remember, Tom? I can remember pre-Dunblane as a young cop, because I worked in a rural area where shotguns, etc., were commonplace in the farming community and all the rest of it. And a firearms certificate in the rural setting, they all got a visit. And it was one of the jobs of what we called the district cops who worked outside the town and dealt with those kind of things. And they generally knew them as well. They knew the people they were dealing with, etc. They had some relationship with them. It's a different environment in a city. Now, what was there any scope then for a cop or a sergeant in the firearms, in the licensing department, going to visit someone? Like our editor comes to mind. If somebody went to visit him, Chris, and said, I'm not happy. There's something not right about that guy. You know the way people talk about him generally. Would that be enough? Would that be enough to not give him a firearm certificate, or was it a ticking of a box?
No.
Did they have to be criminal record?
No, it wouldn't have to be that. Sometimes it wasn't the firearm certificate holder themselves or the shotgun certificate holder themselves. It was somebody living in the same house. I remember revoking a man's firearm certificate for the fact that his son, who was a ne'er-do-well, was living in the same house as him, and I wasn't convinced that the son couldn't get access to the father's weapons. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's if somebody's been convicted of drink driving was a typical one, because it shows an intemperance. And the key was a fit and proper person. You would be a fit and proper person. So while somebody just seeing a dodgy character like Chris. I've just complimented him a few minutes ago, so I think balance it. But no, that's not enough. That's not enough. But what that does, of course, it's like our old days in the CID, Simon. What that does is that brings on other things. Why do you feel he's dodgy? And then you make further inquiries. Yeah. And of course, there were referees. It's got to be said, and we should tell our audience this, that the criteria for getting a shotgun certificate is a lot less than a firearm certificate, which the two are entirely different. Yeah. And a firearm certificate, you really did to jump through hoops. Although, significantly, if there was ever a weapon used in a crime, it was usually a shotgun. But anyway, that was just the way it was. It was thought that firearms were much more dangerous. So yes, it was. And over my time, I've found hundreds and hundreds of firearm certificates. And I've got to say, for the vast majority, firearm certificate holders were very responsible people, and there was never any trouble. And the difficulties we have now, Simon, with armed crime are not shotguns or firearms which have been taken from legitimate firearm certificate holders. They're guns that have been imported in through the smuggling routes that smuggle drugs and money and all sorts of people and everything, or dangerously, they've been replicas that have been converted. And they're dangerous not only to the person at the other end of the barrel, they're dangerous to the person that uses them too, because they can blow up in their hand.
Which is maybe not always a bad thing. So I think that was really the legacy of Dunblane, Tom, without focusing on the victims and their families. And Dunblane still carries that scar and memory, but really the changes to our gun law. And who knows how many lives have been saved because of those changes. I remember when we did the Sheila Anderson case, if it hadn't been for Sheila, we wouldn't have had the wake-up call that you guys had in Edinburgh and we had thereafter about the organised crime that was profiting and flourishing on our streets, right under our noses without our knowledge. Yeah. And I think the Dunblane case brought the issue of firearms and handguns and all the rest of it and made us decide we're not going down that road. Let's get them off the streets. Mm-hmm. We had a few amnesties as well. And who knows how many lives were saved as part of the legacy of Dunblane.
I don't know, but as I say, for me, the lesson was, look, if you have a feeling about someone, you've got to stick in. There was we had an old director of education in the Lothian region, and Thomas Hamilton had applied to hold some boys' club or something in West Lothian area, in the town of Linlithgow, which is just over the border from central Scotland, of course, where he operated from. And this particular director of education had looked at it and said, no, I don't think you're a fit and proper person. And Hamilton had complained and been to his MP and lodged a complaint. And this director of education had been criticised and censured, etc., etc. And he still said no. And I knew about this case, and I knew about him. And when it all happened, I thought, I'm going to contact this old fella, long since retired, this director of education, this had happened many years before, and just tell him, well done, you called it right. Unfortunately, the man was dead, and I couldn't do that. But for all the trouble that Hamilton had brought to his door in the way of complaints and legal action and all the rest of it, he'd stuck to his principles, stuck to his intuitions, and he'd been right.
Yeah.
And he'd been right.
Just to finish on Hamilton, Tom, the podcast that they put together last week, they hinted at impropriety as far as young boys were concerned, taking photographs, stuff, but there was nothing specific about that. Do you have any inside knowledge of that? Did they have any convictions for anything like that, or suspicions?
No. He was a creepy, controlling individual who exercised his desire to control through these boys' clubs, but there was nothing like that. There was no evidential to point to that, and unless something came out post-mortem, but not to my knowledge.
Okay, Tom, you mentioned John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy. Over the course of the next weeks and months, we're going to talk about some real serial killers, some real serious crimes, and they're very interesting. And it'd be good to get some feedback on these from our listeners. That's what we're looking for. But I think we'll wrap up here with a complete change and just a wee mention of the Enron case, because you and I were never really involved, or I wasn't involved in financial crime and all that kind of white-collar crime, although I have many friends who were in the fraud squad and utilised their services many times in inquiries. The Enron case was a kind of landmark case as well for that type of crime, wasn't it?
It was incredible because what was amazing about Enron and some of our other huge financial scandals is that they happened right under our noses, and the people who were responsible were people who were celebrated by our society as being captains of industry and great guys, etc., etc. And I always remember when I was a DI in the Serious Crime Squad, I remember having a conversation with the chief inspector of the fraud squad at that time. And he said to me, Tom, he said, you guys are running about after armed robbers and everything else, but a lot more harm is done by white-collar crime and by fraud. And because he was a senior rank to me, I nodded sagely, but I thought to myself, well, look at nonsense, fraud, who cares of fraud? And he was right, But the one salvation from it, and I've thought about this a lot, the Americans are a lot better than we are at tackling these things because the FBI's roots lie in anti-racketeering operations. We're going right back to the beginning, going right back to Al Capone and the gangsters. And they will take on these frauds and they will take down these big fraudulents a lot more easily than we will. And I give you an example. I know you're a football man. Think about the FIFA scandal and the operations of Sepp Blatter and all the rest of it. Now, that had been going on for years in plain sight, but neither Europol nor Interpol nor anybody else had really taken them down. It took the FBI to do that. And the FBI only got involved because FIFA decided to expand their operations into the United States of America and therefore fell under the auspices of United States federal law. And we've got a lot to learn, I think, because if you think about the banking scandal that almost ruined our country in 2008, Simon, nobody here appeared in court. Nobody went to jail. No prosecutions were ever mounted. I tell you, I think if that had been in America, that would not have been the case.
Somebody would have, they would have made the right inquiries. They're not scared of them. It's a kind of British thing, isn't it? To protect our image.
Well, it's that. It's that the FBI have got the skill set. At the time I was over there working, they were taking on new agents. And the agents came from a variety of sources, but quite a few of them had degrees in accountancy. Because, of course, embezzlement and forgery and these things were federal crimes that the FBI used to investigate. So they were skilled up to do it, whereas we were not.
I always remember our fraud squad, the dealings that I had with them, and the inspector, DI, and the Strathclyde fraud squad was a friend of mine. It was quite a passive thing. And I'm saying this because I don't really have any knowledge about it, just banter really with him. But whereas you and I would, if we found a stolen cheque, we'd want to get it fingerprinted and want to find out who the fingerprint was and go in Chappie's door and put him in the cell. But the fraud squad through here were very much more passive. The attitude was that they don't stop. Fraudsters don't stop. They keep defrauding. And if you look after the admin, if you file the checks and file this so it was never a proactive thing like you're talking about, Tom. Like Al Capone, I suppose, was the very first example of that, where they realised that they could get him on the paperwork and on the finances, if not on the gangster activities.
Yeah.
It was always very passive.
I think that's right. I think you're right. I think in our day, maybe not now, but in our day, it was a very reactive, not proactive thing. They dealt with what was reported to them, but they didn't go digging. And that's not to decry, because I knew a lot of friends of mine were in the fraud squad, were very good officers. And by the way, did work that I don't think I would have been able to do, to be frank.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not that. It was just the attitude. And the fact, I think you've got to go back to sources and what were the police service set up to do in Britain and what was the FBI set up to do. The FBI was actually set up to deal with racketeering in the 1920s, 1930s. That was what J. Edgar Hoover was appointed to do, was to take down the rackets to do with prohibition and all that followed, gambling, the mafia gangs, etc., etc.
We're so lucky to have you here, Tom, our FBI double. You're a double agent, you know that? Not only former Deputy Chief Constable of Lothian Border, but undercover FBI agent all along, I think. All along. It was a cover.
I've been called many things in my life. And that's not all I'm saying is that's not the worst of them. That's not the worst of them.
Tom, our problem is going to be cutting these things within a reasonable length of time, but the job that our friends are doing with their research and with their podcasts. So it's every day on Crime Time Inc. And on the Sunday, you and I will catch up with what they've been doing. Have you enjoyed that? Have you enjoyed doing that and listening to them?
I've enjoyed this chat, as I always do, speaking to yourself, Simon, but I've enjoyed our deep dive team. I think they've provided food for thought. And I think that's what this podcast, that's what Crime Time Inc. is about. It's about food for thought.
And I think Lucy's got a wee soft spot for me. You know that?
Simon, I've got a soft spot for you. It's a bog about 15 minutes before I'm sitting just now. But I'm not going to tell you about that till later.
Great stuff, Tom. Speak soon.
Speak soon. Take care, Simon.